So those are examples of low thyroid hormone levels. What are symptoms of low thyroid hormone?
Being tired, right?
So fatigue is one of the big ones. Because this regulates metabolism and energy usage, low thyroid hormone levels result in low energy production. A person will feel fatigued, low energy. Now, of course, when your body is using all of that energy, what does it create as a byproduct? Heat. So if your thyroid hormone levels are low, your body temperature will be low also. Those are some of the biggest ones. You can also look at things like thinning of the hair, low blood pressure. So thyroid hormone has an effect on blood pressure, and you can have abnormally low blood pressure as a result of low thyroid hormone levels too. Now we were mentioning this in an adult, but if you recall from a previous slide, early on in life, now we're talking infancy here, and then into early childhood a little bit as well. It's also really important for the proper development of the skeletal and nervous systems. So we go back to where we were. If you have a hyposecretion of thyroid hormone in infancy, it leads to something called cretinism. Because thyroid hormone is important for the development of the nervous and skeletal system, if you don't have enough, what sort of characteristics do you think we'd be looking at in a person with cretinism? All right, well, if it's important for the development of the skeletal system and you don't have enough, you will probably end up being small. In fact, cretinism is sometimes classified as a type of dwarfism, along with achondroplasia, pituitary dwarfism, and some other less common ones. But people with cretinism tend to be atypically small in stature, and if it affects the development of the nervous system and you don't have enough, what other sort of things, deficiencies, I guess we could say, might they exhibit? Well, there's often some degree of intellectual disability too, okay? Because they don't have proper development of the nervous system if there's not enough thyroid hormone. There's also some characteristic facial deformities. In other words, there's kind of a face that goes with it that's fairly typical of cretinism. Have you guys ever seen the movie Deliverance? If you haven't, I don't recommend that you go and watch it. It's highly disturbing. But there's a famous scene in that movie of a person sitting on their porch playing the banjo. And you've probably heard the little tune. The actor who played that person, as well as the character, actually had cretinism. It was, the person really had it. And if you ever see a picture of it, the way that man's face looks is pretty typical of cretinism. Again, this term is kind of falling out of favor because it has some like pejorative connotations, like people use it as an insult, you know, call someone a cretin. So not really a term that we use as much anymore, although technically accurate for, you know, other purposes. A lot of times people go with juvenile hypothyroidism, which is a lot wordier. On the other hand, if you have too much thyroid hormone, you can have something called Graves' disease. So we talked about what happens with too little thyroid hormone level. What can happen with too much thyroid hormones?
Oh, your body's overstimulated, right?
Yep.
Your heart, higher blood pressure.
Higher blood pressure, sure.
Nervous.
Yeah, so there can be like other nervous system things that go along with that, a little twitchy maybe. If low thyroid hormone levels are associated with low body temperature, Graves' disease could be associated with higher temperature. If people with low thyroid hormone levels are lethargic and low energy, Graves' disease would be the opposite. Of course, with low thyroid hormone levels, we usually have weight gain associated with that, right? If you're not using the energy, you tend to gain weight. So therefore, Graves' disease, trouble, maintaining body weight as a result. And there's kind of an interesting thing that goes along with Graves' disease, which is a bulging of the eyes. So in this picture on the right, this person has Graves' disease, and you can see the eyes bloodshot, bulging out, kind of reflective of the overall overstimulation of the body. Also produced in the thyroid is this hormone called calcitonin. We've talked about calcitonin before back in AP1 as part of the calcium homeostasis. And I think I mentioned it to you back then too. This book has a very strange approach to calcitonin because they go out of their way more than once to claim that it doesn't do anything. But look, even right here, they contradict themselves. No known effect in humans, antagonist to parathyroid hormone. Well, how can it be both, right? It either does something or it doesn't. But in truth, calcitonin has several important effects in our body as it pertains to calcium homeostasis. So, if you recall the skeletal system in AP1, when calcitonin is released, its job is to help bring calcium levels down. So it will stimulate osteoblasts, and it will increase calcium content in the urine. So it is another hormone produced by the thyroid, but it is not related to thyroid hormone. Okay? Calcitonin is just produced there, but it is not related to the thyroid hormone that we just talked about. Some major differences include their effects. So calcitonin helps lower blood calcium levels. Thyroid hormone regulates cellular metabolism. Also, what type of stimulus regulates thyroid hormone release? We have three types of stimuli, right? Hormonal, humoral, and neural. Which one is regulating thyroid hormone?
Hormonal?
Hormonal. And I haven't said it outright yet, but perhaps you can guess, just based on the info that we have up here, what type of regulatory stimulus is regulating calcitonin?
Humoral?
Humoral. It's in direct response to calcium levels in the bloodstream. So calcium levels go up, you release calcitonin to bring them back down. Okay. If you were to sort of take the thyroid gland, take it off of the trachea, turn it around and look at the posterior side, you would find embedded within it your parathyroid glands. So it is technically a separate gland. It's not part of the thyroid, it just happens to be embedded within the thyroid. Okay, but it is technically a separate gland. You may recall this one from AP1 also because it is the antagonist to calcitonin. Parathyroid glands are producing parathyroid hormone, aka PTH. So, if calcitonin's job is to bring calcium levels down by stimulating osteoblasts to build bone tissue and increasing calcium content in the urine, PTH is the opposite. What does it do?
It stimulates osteoclasts.
It stimulates osteoclasts to resorb bone tissue, releasing calcium into the blood, conserving calcium by decreasing calcium content in the urine, and importantly, it helps activate vitamin D for increased calcium absorption from the food. Like calcitonin, what type of stimulus regulates parathyroid hormone release?
Humoral.
Humoral, right? So with calcitonin, we saw levels go up, you release calcitonin, levels go down, you release PTH, right, to help bring them back up. So they're describing all the things we just said here. This is all review from AP1. We spent a fair amount of time talking about calcium homeostasis. But to recap, levels in the blood fall too low, PTH is released. It has a three-pronged approach to helping bring those levels back up. First of all, osteoclast activity in the bone goes up, so you remove some calcium from the bone. You decrease calcium content in the urine to conserve and prevent loss. And by activating vitamin D, you absorb more from the food. All of that results in bringing your levels back up to normal. As with other hormones, we can see what happens when there is too much or too little parathyroid hormone. When there is too much PTH, you have an excessive removal of calcium from the bones. So it tends to weaken the bones, causing deformities, increasing risk for fractures, and so on. But also, messing with calcium levels in the blood has some pretty bad effects on things like the heart and the nervous system. You might remember from chapter 18 that calcium is both a positive inotropic and chronotropic agent on the heart. And throwing off the levels here can affect the activity of the heart. Also, calcium is important for neurotransmitter release, so it can affect the nervous system and its function too. It can affect the muscular system. Excessive calcium in the blood can also lead to kidney stone formation. And they're not mentioning it here, but hyperparathyroidism, when you have all of this calcium, way too high a calcium floating around in the blood, it's sort of like it has to go somewhere, right? So you're taking it out of the bones, but a resulting consequence is that you also have calcification of soft tissues. And so things like muscles and cartilage around the body start to take this calcium up and harden and calcify as a result. When there is too little parathyroid hormone, too little PTH, it can cause some really serious problems too. Just things like tetany, respiratory paralysis, and death, right? Because again, calcium is necessary for nerve conduction, muscle contraction, the proper function of our heart, and if these levels fall too low, really bad stuff starts to happen. The next gland that we're going to talk about is the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys. This root word renal refers to the kidneys. So the adrenal glands are on top of the kidneys. And although each one is a single gland, functionally it makes a lot of sense to talk about it in two different parts. So we talk about the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. And it should become obvious why once we get to each one of them. But they have, the hormones that they make are totally different. They're regulated by a totally different mechanism, those two areas. So we talk about the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla separately. As with any organ, the cortex is which part? What about the medulla? Any ideas? When we talk about the cortex and medulla, the cortex is the outer part and the medulla is the inner part. Okay? So the adrenal medulla, the inside of the gland, the adrenal cortex, the outer part of the gland. The adrenal cortex makes a few different things that we collectively refer to as corticosteroids, which is a term you might have heard of before because sometimes we use this word in medicine and talk about corticosteroids being used. As we'll see here in a few minutes, it's probably referring to a specific type, okay? But any of the hormones produced in the adrenal cortex can be referred to as corticosteroids. Let's go there first, to the adrenal cortex. When you view it microscopically, there are three different zones to the adrenal cortex. The zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis, and that's in order from superficial to deep. So this is all in the cortex, right? But within the cortex, the very outermost part's the zona glomerulosa, then underneath that fasciculata, and then finally the last part of the cortex, right before you get to the medulla, is the zona reticularis. So you see here, glomerulosa, fasciculata, reticularis. They're mentioning what each one produces. This one produces mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and gonatocorticoids. Don't worry, we'll talk about what each one of those is. Starting first with the zona glomerulosa, they're producing something called mineral corticoids. Well, this last part, corticoid, is just referring to the cortex and the corticosteroids that it produces. The first part of each of these is telling you sort of what it's affecting, right? And mineral corticoids affect the level of some mineral, obviously. Now, the primary mineral corticoid produced in our adrenal cortex is aldosterone. Aldosterone is for the regulation of sodium levels. Aldosterone causes sodium retention. And we're talking about in the kidneys here, so during urine formation. Sodium, like most other electrolytes and minerals, is a normal component of the urine, but the levels of it can vary depending on need, right? So you can have more or less sodium in the urine depending on your current situation. Aldosterone is the hormone that's released for the resorption of sodium, for the retention of sodium. Now, sometimes that can be to help regulate the levels of sodium in your bloodstream, but often we're interested in the secondary effects of sodium retention. What tends to move with the salt, with the sodium, in the same direction? Well, sodium retention often leads to water retention because through osmosis, the water is drawn in the area of, in the direction, I should say, of these solutes. And this can be used for, well, for example, in the urinary system, we're going to talk about something called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism, which is a way of helping to, yeah, I know it's a mouthful,
Yeah.
right? Which is a way of helping to regulate blood pressure in extreme situations. Because you bring the sodium back in, that will result in water following it, increasing fluid volume levels, and can help regulate blood pressure as a result. And as is often the case, when you see sodium moving in one direction, potassium generally moves in the opposite direction. So if it's causing sodium retention, it will often lead to elimination of potassium. Any ideas why sodium and potassium are generally moving in opposite directions in these situations? Goes way back to something we talked about in chapter 3.
They're both positive.
They are, but it relates to that sodium-potassium pump that we talked about, right? We've been using it for all kinds of different things. It generates membrane potentials and concentration gradients, but it works because sodium and potassium are moved in opposite directions. So if you pump sodium back into the body, you end up pumping the potassium out. So aldosterone for sodium retention is our primary mineral corticoid. This is that renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism I mentioned. We're going to talk about this more in the urinary system, so we can put a pin in this for now. Let's move on to the next layer, where we produce glucocorticoids. Mineral corticoids, we're helping regulate levels of a particular mineral, sodium. So glucocorticoid might be involved in the levels of what?
Sugar?
Yeah, sugar, glucose. And that's true. Now, our primary glucocorticoid is cortisol, and it does a lot more than just affect sugar levels, but it does affect sugar levels. So cortisol is the primary glucocorticoid in humans, but you can see other similar compounds like cortisone and corticosterone. Those can be used medicinally sometimes, although they're not produced in our cells. What's the primary reason someone might be taking a glucocorticoid medicinally, corticosteroids? What do we use them for? Medicinally, we tend to use them for inflammation and that kind of thing. Helps bring it down. Okay. So cortisol in us, it's going to do things like elevate blood glucose levels and maintaining blood pressure. Now, the interesting thing about cortisol and really all of the corticosteroids is that they tend to fluctuate throughout the day, and we see this being pretty important with cortisol. So if cortisol is doing things like elevating our blood sugar and our blood pressure, when do you think we might see natural spikes in cortisol levels?
After meals.
Yeah, sometimes after meals. One of the biggest spikes comes in the morning time. It's helping to transition your body from the sleeping state to the resting state by bringing up sugar levels, by bringing up blood pressure. What were you going to say?
I don't think I get that till afternoon.
Yeah. Well, I'll bet you guys are. Familiar with how it works anyway. If you have a relatively consistent schedule, or especially if you have like young children and they wake up at the same time all the time, right? But then one day something magical happens and the kids are at somebody else's house and you've got the day off from work and you're like, sweet, I'm going to sleep in, right? But then what happens?
You wake up.
You wake up at the same time anyway. The reason why, one of the reasons why, is because your body is just so used to this transition to wakefulness at the same time that it goes, all right, it's 6:30 or whatever, time for some cortisol, time to get up, right? And your blood sugar and your blood pressure start to rise and you start to wake up. And that is a natural occurrence. Now, cortisol is also sometimes referred to as a stress hormone, which some of you guys might have heard of.
I've seen the commercials.
Yeah. Normally, all of the corticosteroids are controlled by one of those hormonal axes. Okay? Hypothalamus, pituitary makes that ACTH that we talked about last time. That stimulates production of these corticosteroids. But it can be, that axis can be like overruled, so to speak, during times of stress. And you produce extra ACTH. One of the results is that you make extra cortisol too. And cortisol at normal natural levels does things like we said, sort of invigorating your body. Waking up is one of the ways that you can think of it, although there are other spikes throughout the day too, but that's a good way to think of its effect. If it exists in too high of levels, though, you start to exhibit some different symptoms. So excessive levels of cortisol, especially on a consistent basis, can result in things like high blood pressure, nervousness and that kind of thing, high blood sugar levels, and importantly, inhibition of immune system function. We mentioned that it reduces inflammation. Well, it does that, or sort of secondary consequences, reduction of the immune system. So that's how a lot of us are used to thinking about it. Again, don't think of cortisol as a bad hormone. If it were bad, we wouldn't make it, right? It's only bad when we produce too much of it, okay? Excessive production. Hypersecretion. Now, I'm going to talk about a different kind of hypersecretion. We were mentioning stress, right? That can do it. But you can also have hypersecretion of cortisol as a result of something that we call Cushing's disease. So this is an excessive production of cortisol. You see here some of the things we talked about. Depression of immune system function. Cortisol in large amounts also has a negative effect on connective tissues, like cartilage and bone. It can weaken those. It's not up here, but it also tends to promote fat deposition and muscle wasting. So you're decreasing muscle mass while increasing fat levels. And interestingly, with Cushing's disease, the fat deposition occurs in some characteristic places. So with Cushing's disease, they sometimes talk about a moon face. So a lot of fat deposition in the cheeks and stuff makes the face very round. And a buffalo hump, which is fat deposition at the base of the neck there. If you look at this picture, there's a before and after of a woman before she had Cushing's disease, before the onset of Cushing's disease, and afterwards. And the buffalo hump part is really obvious when comparing before and after. And you can kind of see Now we're not looking at the face straight on, but you can still make out the increased fat deposition in the face from after versus before. But to me, the really interesting thing about this picture is how did she know she was going to get Cushing's disease to take it before? Some mysteries might just go unsolved forever, but I always wondered that about this.